Good morning, my name is Boglárka KOLLER and I'm going to give you a brief lecture on the identity of EU citizens. We are going to discuss the question marks and current dilemmas in Europe. First, we are going to talk about the integration process. So where are we now in the integration process? If we look around and we look at the last decade in the European Union, we can actually argue that it was the decade of identity crisis in the Union. There were several fragmentation lines in the integration process. We can name some of those. So if we look back in the last 10 years, we can talk about the constitutional treaty, the failure of this constitutional treaty, the French and Dutch no for the constitutional treaty, which created a kind of uncertainty in the European Union. Then we can also mention the failure of the Lisbon strategy and also the Irish no for the Lisbon Treaty again in 2009. So all of these were signs and lack of support of the common European project. Then we all know about the serious global financial and economic crisis in the European Union, which hit Europe in 2008, and we still feel some of the negative effects of this economic crisis. Then we can continue our list with mentioning the Eurozone crisis of the financial solidarity in Europe. We can also add the crisis in Ukraine, which created a war situation in the geographic boundaries, within the geographic boundaries of Europe. We can still continue our list if we argue that the last decade was the decade of identity crisis by mentioning the terrorist attacks in European capitals. And also if we talk about enlargement process, we can again argue that EU is starting to be a weakening magnet. So enlargement is close to stalling, and the European Union is still attractive to some of the countries, for example the countries in the Western Balkan states, but for example not anymore to Turkey. And last but not least, I should mention here the migration crisis and the idea of demolishing the Schengen zone, which I think currently is the most serious crisis areas in Europe. So where are we? Where are we with the project of Common Europe? There's a big question mark in the middle of the slide, and we see another burning euro, so there are problems with the common currency. And if we imagine it, if we look at this girl who is looking into the mirror and she doesn't find her picture in the mirror, we can have the same analogy for Europe, that Europe doesn't find its face in the mirror either. So we are at a turning point, and Europe should find the ways where Europe is heading towards. There are some images, but we can just discuss here what kind of crisis we are at the moment. We can imagine a nice tree with the leaves falling, and we don't see the roots of the tree, of course, but we see as multiple rooted crises. So there is an institutional crisis. At the same time, we can talk about the growth crisis in Europe, competitiveness crisis, social crisis, political crisis, institutional crisis, and we can also talk about a kind of the most serious crisis area. What I can mention and I'm going to talk about is the legitimacy crisis, so the crisis of the individuals in Europe. So what we are experiencing is a kind of multi-rooted interlinked crisis, and in order to get over these periods in the history of Europe, we have to find solutions for all of these crisis areas. There is another nice image of describing this crisis. It's a kind of scissor that is cutting the European map into pieces. So we can also, we experience that there are more and more fragmentation lines on the continent and also on the British Island as well, so on the territory of the European Union. So there are a lot of divisions between the member states and also inside the member states between the different parts of the states. But first of all, we have to mention here that if we are living under these crisis circumstances, we have to mention that foremost, what is the most important for us is that we are living in a Europe where we can talk about the changed outer environment. So the outer political environment, economic environment, and social environment changed. So we have to look around Europe to find the solutions. First, I have to mention here that there is a new kind of relationship with the United States of America. United States of America is more active in Europe. Here I have to mention the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership document, which is, the abbreviation is TTIP, which is currently under negotiation, but we all know that there are a lot of question marks around this TTIP. So there are a lot of protests on the streets of Europe. There are a lot of disagreements around it, the decision makers, the politicians, and also some of the citizens groups are against this TTIP. So we don't know when this is going to be signed, and probably it's going to be a long process. There are a lot of counter arguments against it. US is very active in Europe, more active than it was a decade ago, but we can also mention here Russia as a new player in the European politics as well. We have to mention here the changed Russian foreign policy, which the big change happened around 2012 when Putin started to express a new kind of Russian foreign politics. And some of the authors are talking about the new Cold War, which I don't really agree with to name this period as a Cold War period, but there are arguments that we are experiencing a very similar era than it was at the time of the Cold War. Some people, some analysts mention it as a second Cold War. Hopefully it will not come, but one thing is sure that Europe is facing a new Russian foreign policy, and Europe has to find answer to this new changed outer environment. To continue this argumentation, we have to call the argument of Ian Manners, who is a famous author in European integration, and he developed the concept of normative power Europe, NPE. Again, there is an abbreviation for that. And this concept describes the circumstances that Europe can transfer its values, principles outside the boundaries of Europe. So Europe is able to transfer the values outside the boundaries. It is called as normative power Europe because it argues this theory that the norms can be transported outside Europe. Europe believed in this very nice concept, normative power Europe, but as we see in the Ukraine crisis, that this very nice concept failed, and there are a lot of shortcomings nowadays of the European neighborhood policy and also the Eastern Partnership. So it was true, this concept, until it didn't match the counter interest of Putin's Russia, because then it turned out the normative power Europe that didn't really work at the time of the Ukraine crisis, and still. So there are a lot of question marks if Europe is able to transfer its norms, values, principles outside Europe. And here I have to mention another big change which happens outside the boundaries of Europe, and this is the migration challenge, which is coming from the Middle East and also from North Africa. There are various routes that the migrants can take to come to Europe, and this is the most important crisis area nowadays. Just to show you some statistics. These are the asylum seekers in the European Union, and if you just look at this graph, you will see that there is an exponential growth in the last couple of years, in the last 3 years, last 2-3 years. So the problems that Europe had with regard to migration formerly are not the same as Europe is having nowadays. So the systems, the Dublin system that Europe developed formally and that was working to some extent is not working anymore. And you can also see a picture of some migrants coming to the source of the continent by very weak boats, and this is a very dangerous thing. How these we are losing a huge amount of people by how they come to Europe. Second, I have to mention here again an important change in Europe, that yes, we were talking about the Ukraine crisis, that war appeared in the geographical boundaries of Europe, because Ukraine belongs to the geographical Europe, not to the European Union, but to Europe, yes. And we can talk about terrorism as not war, but as a kind of new security challenge to Europe, because the uncertainty, the fear appears in European cities. Here I just included some of the famous pictures of the Brussels terrorist attack, Paris terrorist attack, and I should have started with Charlie Hebdo terrorist attack, because that was the very important first one in this among those that really threw attention to terrorism. But there is also a movement in Europe that, and you can see this a crowd with the sign of not being afraid. So mentioning that Europe is trying to move against this and try to express the attitude that we are not afraid of terrorism, but still the everyday people, they have the fear in their minds. I think so. So I think it's a new kind of environment where we can talk about a new kind of securitization in Europe. Go to the visions and ideas. Here I want to just, of course, without including everybody, I would like to quote some of the important opinion makers, decision makers. So how do they feel about the future of Europe and current challenges? First, Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission, he said that we feel we need capital markets union, energy union, economic and monetary union, but we also think that we need a security union. I think it's important that this decision maker is talking about security issues in Europe. Anyway, the second opinion maker that I want to include is Donald Tusk, who is talking about the challenges of Europe. He is saying that the two biggest challenges to the future of the European Union on the agenda is the United Kingdom's future membership of the European Union and the migration crisis. So for him, two things, the Brexit and migration. On neither can we afford to fail. This is a critical moment. It's high time we started listening to each other's arguments more than to our own. It's natural in negotiations that positions harden as we get closer to the crunch time. But the risk of breakup is real, because this process is indeed very fragile. Handled with care, what is broken cannot be mended. It's a kind of pessimistic vision of Europe, and he says that if these two things, so Brexit and migration crisis, cannot be solved, Europe can break up. Documented. Again, we have to mention here François Hollande. It was after the terrorist attacks in Paris. So he said, the acts committed on Friday night in Paris and at the start are acts of war. So mentioning war again. This constitutes an attack against our country, against its values, against its youth, against its way of life. I still struck France because it's free and a nation of human rights. This is not a war of civilization, as these assassins don't have any. This is a war against jihadist menace that threatens not just France, but also Europe. So it's again showing this new changed environment and the fear what the everyday European citizens have. And being a Hungarian, I cannot miss to quote our Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, who is, as we all know, have a counter position in the migration crisis to Hollande and to Merkel. According to Orban, it's not acceptable, as would be the case under the Commission's proposal, for someone in Brussels to decide that the countries of the EU must solve their demographic and economic problems through immigration. We believe that there are countries in the EU which wish to solve the problem in this manner, and there are others which do not. In other words, the EU cannot create a system which it lets in migrants and then prescribes mandatory resettlement quotas for every member state. Now that we have Brussels officials' proposal on the table, there is enormous pressure on us. If we don't stop Brussels with a referendum, they will indeed impose on us masses of people with whom we don't wish to live together. So it's a very harsh statement against the countries, the statements of France and Germany, and is going to and addresses the issue of the quota system. And as we all know, there is a referendum planned in Hungary for the citizens to decide that they accept this quota system, this mandatory quota system, or not, which is the position of other EU member states. And there is, last but not least, I want to close the list of quotations by a journalist who said that we have to somehow shake these big decision makers and to call their attention to the need of bottom-up processes in Europe. And according to this journalist, but now, dear European ministers, please get out of your diplomatic centers. Europe is no longer about diplomacy, but internal affairs. Spend your Sundays under a white tent in a park and invite people to come and talk to you. Wander around in local markets. You will be surprised how people are actually interested in Europe. Travel to other countries and talk to people in their own language. You will seem less of a foreign remote technocrat. These people might not vote for you as they are not yet your constituents, but the decisions you take certainly have an importance on their lives as well. So it's important to mention here that sometimes we tend to look at only the decision maker's opinion, but we have to ask the people on the street, in the market, to get their reaction to these crisis areas. Here, I have to mention here another area where, although I'm always talking about the crisis areas, but the European decision makers decided how to get out from these crisis areas already. So nowadays we talk about the migration crisis all the time, but we shouldn't forget that there is one area where Europe is getting further, Europe is getting deeper, and this is the area of the monetary union. And nowadays what we are experiencing is the kind of supranational approach in this area. So the genuine monetary and economic union is on the agenda, and the decision makers, which you can see on the slide, they decided to go further with this integration. That shows us also that if some countries do not want to participate in this deeper, genuine economic and monetary union, they are going to fall out from this cooperation. I'm going to cover this issue later. Next, I have to mention here another development, what was already quoted by Donald Tusk, is the so-called exits. So nowadays, if you look around, we never ever in the EU history experienced that exit was mentioned so often, all the time. New terms were born in the last decade, starting with Grexit, which we used for describing Greek exit from the Eurozone, but also Greek exit from the whole EU. Then I have to mention here Brexit, which is on the agenda now, and there is going to be a referendum in June for deciding that Britain is staying in or falling out from the EU. But they are not so famous, the other words, Frexit, but it was also developed by one of the analysts already, describing the possible exit of France from the EU. which we don't talk about it, and there is it's not on the agenda, but some of the theorists already developed that word. And who knows, maybe new exit words are going to be created, for example, Haxit, just to put together Hungary's exit maybe. I don't want to have a very depressive view on these exits, but the pure fact that we are talking about exits nowadays shows us that there are a lot of disattachment from the European Union, from the whole EU project. And here I want to show you some nice graphics also to show us what are the solutions, what are the possible scenarios out of this crisis. In the first picture you see a man who is telling that let's get back to the old house because the new house doesn't work, so you can see a new falling house here. So maybe we shouldn't spill over to other integration areas, but we should go back to the old house and find the elements on which the European member states can agree. Maybe we should give up the euro, that can be also included in that, or we should do another kind of integration, go back to a little old house and find the elements on which we can all agree. So that is the so-called minimalist approach. The next one, we have done so much already, so let's reinforce it. So if we have done so much in the integration process, we should somehow save it for the future generations. So here you can see a building where it's on the second picture, where the building is reinforced with some kind of new bricks and it's still there, so it stays. The third scenario is the lady asked, let's keep building what we have achieved together so far. Why stop here? So it's the ambitious kind of way out from the agony. Means that if we keep building, we don't care about all these crisis areas, we still try to reinforce the achievements, then we can save European Union and European unity. The fourth one, this man, it's even a more ambitious plan. We must speed up and finish the building now, even if it means leaving some people behind. It's very important, this last sentence, that keep building whatever happens. If some people, they just don't want to join, for example, the banking union, or they don't want to be in the participate in the genuine monetary union, doesn't matter. We have a core in Europe. We have some people who are stronger than the others, and they are going to build up an even stronger Europe. So it's even a more speedy approach towards ambition. And last but not least is the fifth picture on my right, and this means that this is a new concept. The lady says, let's reconsider the whole design. We need to make this building more transparent and accountable. So this fifth scenario describes a scenario where we address the European issues turning towards the citizens. So let's involve the citizens more in this whole integration process. How shall we imagine European identity in this whole very fluxy environment? We have to turn to some classics. Jean-Jacques Rousseau once said that love of the country is 100 times more passionate than what you feel for your lover. So you have to imagine this kind of emotional attachment. So we have to ask, with regard to Europe, you have to ask that, are we going to feel this ever when we talk about European identity? Identity means self-understanding of the individual. In order to define myself, I have to define the others as well. So who I am not. In order to define myself, who I am, I have to understand who I am not. It's very important that I'm always comparing myself with others. There is a multiple character in the identity. So I identify myself if I talk about the collective attachments to local, regional, national, European, global identities I have to mention here. They are together in my identity structure, so I have different elements. And it's always a boundary issue. So if I differentiate myself looking at other communities, I always find the boundary of my community. So it's a boundary issue that tells us who I am. There is a famous author called Benedict Anderson who said that the nation is an imagined political community, imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. This sentence is very nicely depicts the situation that it's very subjective. So it's enough for an individual to imagine the national history and imagine the enemies and the glorious times in the history, and it doesn't matter if it really happened in the past, but because an individual is not going to check if that was a real history. If they learned it in the elementary school and grammar school, it's enough that we have these symbols, and so it's enough to see the imagination. Formerly, imagination went through reading the newspapers, reading the same books is how you imagine the history. Nowadays, we read the blogs, we read the internet, we read these webinars, and then we imagine something about identity. There are two poles of national identities, cultural and ethnic, and civic, if we talk about the national past. National identity is defined by descent, cultural elements, common myth, language, symbols, customs, when we talk about cultural and ethnic identification. If we talk about civic identity, we define belonging through the political community, through the certain territory and political institutions, legal systems, rights and duties of the citizens. That's a different definition. These two poles are existing in current nations. So, for example, in Hungary also we can talk about the civic identification of the individuals, but also the cultural and ethnic identification of the individuals as well. So we currently, in current nations, we don't find pure models, but in the past it's important how the nations were built up. So in some nations, cultural identification was most important. For example, we can take the example of Germany. And we can take the example of France, where civic and ethnic identification, building up these two poles, went hand in hand together. Next, what about the models? If you look at, there are various models to imagine the identity in Europe. First, we talk about a hierarchic model, where we put the national identification at the top of the identity hierarchy. But we can also imagine identification as a concentric circles around us, so where the local identification is the most important for us, and then the national and the European global. But what I think describes the best this whole situation is the network of identities, where we can talk about a dynamic network where in one life situation, the national identity is the most important, in another, the local identity is the most important. So we can talk about an identity net, and there are light bulbs in each junction points of the net, and they can be more intensive and less intensive at different periods of the lifetime. How are identities formed? We have to mention here that they are either formed by the decision makers, elites, opinion makers. So they are coming. We have inputs coming from the top, from the elites. So there is a top-down process. So some of the symbols are constructed, but also it's very important that we build up our identity through bottom-up processes, through socialization processes. What about Europe? And here, this is my last topic I'm going to mention here, because I mentioned boundaries. It's all about boundaries. Everything is if I take my personal identification that I'm a woman, I know it because I'm not a man. So I'm European because I'm not non-European. So there are a lot of things which we define by telling who I'm not. Europe's geographical boundaries do not tell us too much about Europe's identity, because they do not coincide with the historical, political, cultural, mental boundaries of the continent. But yes, if we are geographers, we have an easy job, because we can define, there is a definition of what Europe means. And as you see, there was always a problem to define the eastern boundary of Europe, because all of the others were given by the nature. the Atlantic Ocean in the west, the Mediterranean Sea in the south, the Arctic Ocean in the north, and the eastern boundary, the Ural, the Caspian Sea and the Caucasus, they had to be defined because they can be closer or further to define the boundary of Europe. The eastern boundary was first defined as it is now by a Swedish officer in the Russian service, suggested that Europe's boundaries should be pushed back from the Don to the Ural. So it was, and since then we always mention that the Ural mountain is the boundary of the eastern boundary of Europe. There is no other boundary post in the whole world which has seen so many broken hearts, because the Tsarist exiles who were marching to Siberia regularly stopped at the post and took the last handful of European soul and said, "Oh, I left now Europe." Actually, if we would like to interpret this legend, Europe was not European, she was coming from the east. Europe provides the mythical link between the ancient Asian civilizations and Greece, and Europe's ride was following the path of the sun from east to the west, which has an important message for us, that we tend to think that Europe is Western, but Europe is as much Eastern. Europe has Eastern roots. And later, how did the ancient Greeks interpret the boundaries? For the ancient Greeks, the territory of southeastern Europe meant Europe, and they regarded the River Don as the eastern boundary of the continent. So they didn't know too much about the other part of Europe. They just concentrated on the southeastern part. So geographically, it was a narrower territory than it became later known. Then if we mention the Roman Empire, we have to see the Roman limes, the boundaries of the Roman Empire, and we have to say here that the current continent is cut into two parts, the northern and southern parts, and it makes a difference that a certain territory was or wasn't the integral part of Europe. France and Spain was part of the Roman Empire, but Scandinavia is not. So we find a time in the history of Europe where the north-south boundary is there. It's not only now in the time of the Euro crisis that we differentiate between the northern and southern countries, but at the time of the Roman Empire we can also find a boundary. Then let's talk about Charles the Great. So the Carolingian Empire meant the western part of the continent, a territory which was not reached by the Arabic conquest. And this is the time when the east-west delineation could be rooted back. So we can root back to the east-west differentiation to the 8th and 9th century, to Charles the Great, and we can also argue that this is the territory of Europe where when we talk about the core of Europe, we somehow put it there to this territory. But Eric Hobsbawm, who is a rather leftish historian, said that referring to Charles the Great is the so-called small Europe ideology, which intentionally leaves out part of the continent. But it has a symbolic meaning, because still today those who do the most for the European unity, they get the Charles Prize, or in German, Karlspreis, each year for those who contributed a lot for Europe. Angela Merkel has this, but the Hungarian György Konrad also has this. There was a big schism between the Western and Eastern Christendom in the 11th century in Europe. If we continue with Reformation, we will see, and we talk about, if we look at these pictures of Luther and Calvin, we also find a very complicated situation in Europe, because some regions were reached by Protestantism, but others not. But Protestantism gave Europe a new focus, especially in the northern countries. So this is a kind of map of the religious map. We can more find some patches on the map than real boundaries, because, for example, in the Transylvania, which belongs to Romania nowadays, the movement of Reformation reached that territory, but other territories were not reached by Reformation. Europe is a relatively modern idea if we talk about the philosophical side. It gradually replaced the earlier concept of Christendom in a complex intellectual process from the 14th to the 18th century. Modernism, the ideology of enlightenment, contributed a lot what we think about Europe. The myth of the superior quality of the European civilization is still there. Even in postmodern, where we are now, we put all the other civilization next to the European civilization, and we argue that all of them have their superior quality. But as the Europeans think of themselves, it's very important that they still have this superiority kind of feeling. It's a misconception, but how Europe thinks the other parts of the world is still there. On the other hand, if Europe looks at the East, anything vaguely Eastern Oriental tends to be considered backward, inferior, and hence worthy of neglect. This is again a kind of way of thinking that Europe developed throughout history, and it has its roots in the Enlightenment period. If we talk about development differences on the map, I have to mention here that in the 19th century, with regard to economic development, there was an internal boundary between the developed, industrialized, capitalized urban West and the underdeveloped agricultural and only partly urban East. So there are some legitimacy of these boundary differentiations, but still it's important to mention that we cannot make one boundary so easily between East and West. East of the River Arb, if somebody ever studied Marxist history, we all know this nice expression. So this East-West differentiation, the East-West boundary line should be drawn along the River Arb. And next to the Iron Curtain, again we jump another period in history, in the 20th century. Here I have to mention that the Iron Curtain created a physical division line between East and West, so it was not just a mental division line that I mentioned formerly. The Iron Curtain Berlin Wall created a stable physical division line between the Western European countries and countries that belonged to the Soviet control. So there was not a question if a country in the Eastern Bloc, they never had the chance for decades to actually visit the Western part. So integration and European integration only happened in the Western part of the continent. But there were signs that the countries forced to live under Soviet control did not accept this situation, and their list of revolts and protests against the Soviet system, starting in 1953 in East Berlin, quoting the revolts in East Berlin, 56th Revolution in Hungary, the Prague Spring in 1968, and the Solidarity Movement in Poland, that were all signs of these countries that they didn't accept the Eastern model, and they wanted to belong to rather to Central Europe. What happened after 89 and 90? End of dividing East and West, back to Europe, that was the official rhetoric of post-communist countries. But as we experienced afterwards, the mental division lines between West and East still there, still nowadays there. Just one sign that the countries that joined the European Union in 2004 are still mentioned as new member states. So the West-East division line is still there. And they are internal boundaries of Europe, and Europe is more differentiated. So we cannot anymore talk about East and West, but there is a multi-speed in Europe. So what about the EU? People often incline to identify European Union with Europe, which is only partly right, because Europe exists outside the European Union as well. The boundary of Europe is also a boundary on the map of the continent, so the EU boundary is also a boundary within Europe, we can interpret in that way. And new enlargement waves always constitute a new Europe, because Europe always gained and took up new members. The last wave of enlargement happened with taking Croatia on board. But what about the division lines? There are new division lines, north and south. For example, due to the effects of sovereign debt crisis and the euro crisis, a new north-south division line was born. As you see on my slide, German Betrüger in der Euro-Familie, and there is a sculpture depicting the Greeks, which means that through this crisis, a very important new division line of north and south appeared on the scene. And last but not least, I have to mention here that if you would like to draw a map, it's not easy anymore, because who belongs to Europe, on what is the criteria, on the geographically, historically, politically, socially, or if we take the cultural elements, so what the cultural achievements, we can even, it's not easy to draw a map, because Shakespeare belongs to the European heritage and European cultural heritage, but Dostoevsky also belongs to the European cultural heritage. So on that level, it's even more hard to define the boundaries on which we can define ourselves and our identity. Thank you very much, and I'm open to any questions.